Hello, everyone. This is Rabbi Dr. Juan Bejarano Gutierrez. For those of you who had joined us in the live presentation of this shiur, I wanted to apologize. There were two individuals that joined the link. They were two anti-Semites, and they began to share disturbing images as well as racial comments. And we decided to go ahead and just cancel the entire thing and record without a live audience. Again, it's never happened before, and it was a very disturbing situation, but the class, I think, is extremely important, and we want to continue with that. The impetus for this class actually came about a week and a half ago. There was a rabbi online on Facebook who had invited a number of individuals to become friends. And as it turned out, I think on further research or evaluation, he determined that a number of these individuals were not halachically Jewish, and he asked them in a public post to unfriend themselves. It was a very disturbing and a very distasteful post, and he received criticism from many individuals, some of whom were Orthodox. The justification that he gave was that he would be spending a tremendous amount of time on the material that he was going to be sharing. He was focused only on Jews, and he thought that perhaps non-Jews might be offended by what he was going to write, or because of the fact that some of them apparently were individuals who were, I think he termed it, mixing Judaism and Christianity. I was very disturbed by that post, and the reason for that is because I've seen condescending attitudes towards non-Jews by a number of individuals over many years. And I felt that it was important to address this because I think, especially after October the 7th, we live in a different world where anti-Semitism has become, in many ways, quite open in many parts of society, even within the United States. And I think that it's important for the Jewish community to understand the elements that exist internally within the Jewish community. And if there's an inappropriate perspective on non-Jews, everything should be done to resolve that, to fix that, if you will. If there's a perspective of non-Jews that is circulating within Jewish circles, and it's not consistent with Torah Judaism, with traditional Judaism, that should be something that should be researched, understood, and ultimately corrected toward, I think, what the ideal perspective is. And the person, I think, that in many ways highlights the true perspective on non-Jews is the Rambam, Rabbi Moses ben Maimon, or Maimonides. And everything that we'll be looking at is ultimately based on his work or a couple of other works that comment on his writings. Now, one of the things that I think we need to start off with is that the Rambam, of course, is the premier or uh, the greatest halachist of the medieval period. He was born in Cordova. He fled to Morocco probably at the age of 12 or so, and then eventually would wind up in Fostat outside of modern-day Cairo, where he would serve the remainder of his life as a court physician and of course, leader of the Jewish community there. Um, in many ways, we often identify the Rambam not just as a halachist, but of course as a philosopher, an Aristotelian. And this aspect of his philosophical bent is extremely important in how we understand his attitudes towards non-Jews, because philosophy, of course, at a very basic level is the love of wisdom, right? If we look at the origin of the Greek term, but it's about questions and understanding knowledge about fundamental aspects of life, human existence, and those approaches can be applied to theology and a number of other areas of knowledge. But the Rambam's interest in philosophy was not something that was regulated simply to the Moreh Nevuchim, to the Guide to the Perplexed. It's actually something that pervades his halachic writings in the Mishneh Torah, for example. And what we'll find is that this idea of philosophy in many ways informs his attitudes towards the non-Jew. Why is that? Well, philosophy is in many ways expects truth to be universal. Truth has to be accessible by all individuals. And if this is the case, then it in many ways explains why the Rambam held a very different attitude towards non-Jews than what we see in certain circles of the Jewish community today. And I think it's something that's worth reviewing and investigating. Now, Rabbi David Hartman of the Shalom Hartman Institute wrote a book called Maimonides, Torah, and Philosophic Quest. It's an amazing book. I read it about 24 years ago, and I'm going through it again because I think it's just such an important work, which investigates this, in many ways, I wouldn't say the unity, but the use of philosophy by the Rambam in understanding halacha and in his general worldview. Now, David Hartman states the following. He says the Torah does not begin with Sinai, but portrays men relating to God prior to the revelation of the law. And that's obviously something that's very basic. The patriarchs, even before that, Noah, or we can talk about Shem and Ever and other individuals, are individuals who know about the God of creation. They don't do so through the mechanism of Matan Torah, the giving of the Torah at Sinai. They know about him in some other form, whether it's through tradition or ultimately through some type of philosophical process, which of course we often attribute to Abraham Avinu, to Abram, and ultimately Abraham, our father. But it's something that is important to note because, of course, these individuals are not Jews. They exist before Sinai. And even though they're part of this chain, one might say, from the creation of the world that eventually will lead up to Sinai, um, the status of the non Jew is something that doesn't prevent them from serving Hashem, serving God, and seeking to do his will. Now, the Rambam, of course, as I noted, believed that truth had to be universal and it had to be universally accessible. In the Mishneh Torah and Hilchot Yesodei HaTorah, the foundations of the Torah, he states the vital principle of all flesh is the form which God has given it. The superior intelligence in the human soul is the specific form of the man who is perfect in his intellect. To this form, the Torah refers to the text, let us make man in our image after our likeness. This means that man should have a form that knows and apprehends idealistic beings that are devoid of matter, such as angels, which are forms without substance, so that man is like the angels. I highlighted the phrase all flesh because I think it's extremely important. And in many ways, it underlies and explains why the Rambam did not have a view that Jews innately were superior to non Jews. Because he believes, in essence, that God has given every human being intelligence. The human soul is related to the intellect. And as such, all flesh are able to use that intellect, that reason, the ability to think things out, to question, and use that to come to the realization that there is one God that is not bound by time or matter, and that is ultimately the source of all things. Now, the Rambam would later write in the Moreh Nevuchim, in the Guide to the Perplexed, one believes in the prophets due to his prophecy and not his lineage, such as Job, Zophar, Bildad, Eliphaz, and Elihu. And he makes a statement, all of whom were not Jewish. Should Jewish or Gentile prophet urge and encourage people to follow the religion of Moses without adding to it or subtracting from it, like Isaiah, Jeremiah, and the others, a miracle would be required of him. Now, the key takeaway from this, of course, is highlighted in the yellow, all of whom were not Jewish. The Rambam doesn't see any problem with this. The fact that Job, Sophar, Bildad, Eliphaz, and Elihu are not individuals who are part of the covenant at Sinai. He doesn't believe that that's a requisite for individuals to encounter the God of creation. And in fact, Rabbi David Hartman argues that essentially there are two ways to know Hashem or God. It's through Sinai, through the Torah, to the Torah, or through creation itself. One of the things that's interesting is that when we put on a talit in the morning, we have the bracha for the commandment to enwrap ourselves in tzitzit. But there's also a secondary blessing or a secondary statement. Bless the Lord, O my soul. O Lord, you are very great. You are clothed in majesty and splendor, wrapped in a robe of light. You have stretched out the heavens like a curtain, if I remember the exact phrasing correctly. It's this idea that the beauty, the majesty of God can be known through creation. And creation is something that is accessible to all humankind. And so for the Rambam, the idea that you would have non-Jewish prophets is completely, it makes sense. Why would it not make sense? Because in many ways, it's critical to understand that God's presence must be accessible to all of creation. Now, Rabbi David Hartman comments the following. He states, in Chilchot Yesodei HaTorah and in Chilchot Teshuvah, immortality of the soul is linked to the intellectual faculty of man. Now, what is the relation to the topic that we're talking about? Well, it's very simple. Every human being contains a soul. Hashem created us with a soul, and as a consequence, the soul is linked to the intellectual faculty, the ability of humans to reason. As such, God is not inaccessible to those individuals that are outside of the covenant. And again, this is why the Rambam could not hold the view that non-Jews were somehow inherently inferior to Jews who were part of the covenant. Now, the Rambam would continue and write in the Mishneh Torah. So we're going back and forth between the Mishneh Torah, the magnum opus of the Rambam, and of course the Moreh Nevuchim, the Guide to the Perplexed. But here, when he's writing about the Shemitah and the Yovel, he states not only the tribe of Levi, but every single individual from among the worlds, inhabitants whose spirit moved him and whose intelligence gave him understanding to withdraw from the world in order to stand before God to serve and to minister to him. Behold, this person has been consecrated, and God will be his portion forever and ever. God will acquire for him sufficient goods in this world, just as he did for the priest and the Levites. Now, what's amazing about this passage is that it compares the tribe of Levi, but it makes it clear that any individual from any place in the world can be moved. Their intelligence gives them understanding. They seek out Hashem, they find him, and they can be consecrated and granted a portion by God. It's an amazing statement because it says that the God of creation is accessible to all the creatures, to humans of any lineage. It's not dependent upon them being part of the people of Israel. Now, we might ask, well, if that's the case, why is the Torah necessary? What's the benefit of course, being part of the covenant in Sinai? We'll get to that eventually, but right now, what we want to do is we want to backtrack and look at the case of Abram and later Abraham, Abraham Avinu. Now, of course, we're familiar with the Midrashim that talk about how Abraham essentially deduces logically through reason, through a inquisitive nature that he has, that ultimately the images, the pesilim, the idols that his father is selling, or the society in which he lives is worshiping, are false, that they're not really gods. And so we read here in Mishneh Torah on foreign worship and the customs of the nations. The world moved on in this fashion because the Rambam prior to this is talking about the corruption of the worship of God prior to the introduction of idolatry or idols. Till that pillar of the world, the patriarch Abraham was born after he was weaned while still an infant. His mind began to reflect by day and by night. He was thinking and wondering, how is it possible that this celestial sphere should be continuously be guiding the world and have no one to guide it and cause it to turn around, for it cannot be that it turns around of itself. He had no teacher, no one to instruct him in aught. He was submerged in the Ur of the Chaldees among silly idolaters, his father and mother and the entire population worshiping idols, and he worshiped with them. But his mind was busily working and reflecting till he had attained the way of truth, apprehended the correct line of thought, and knew that there was one God, that he guides the celestial sphere and created everything, and that among them all that exists, there is no God beside him. And he realized that the whole world was in error, and that what had occasioned their error was that they had worshipped the stars and the images, so that the truth perished from their minds. Abraham was 40 years old when he recognized his creator, having attained this knowledge. He began to refute the inhabitants of the Ur of the Chaldees, arguing with them and saying to them, the course you are following is not the way of truth. He broke the images and commenced to instruct the people that it was not right to serve anyone but the God of the universe, to whom alone it was proper to bow down, offer up sacrifices, and make libations, so that all human creatures might in the future know him. And I think that that last line, so that all human creatures might know him, in many ways encapsulates the mission of Abraham Avinu. But I think in certain ways it also reflects the ultimate purpose of the Torah at Sinai. The Torah was given to the people of Israel to live as a holy community, But what is the ultimate purpose of that? To make the name of God known throughout the earth, I would contend. And I think that the Rambam would agree. In fact, Abraham Avinu here is smashing idols. He's telling people, for lack of a better term, he's evangelizing individuals to the knowledge of the God of the universe. And of course, as he travels, he leaves these places, goes to Haran. We read that there were souls that he made. These individuals that he reached out to were non-Jews. They were not part of the covenant, but Abraham believes that it is critical. It's part of his mission to share with them the knowledge that he has been able to deduce. And of course, ultimately, Hashem corresponds and reveals himself to him and to the promise that he will make to him on various issues. Now, if we continue looking at the Mishneh Torah, foreign worship and the customs of the nations, in many ways, we can sort of look at why the Torah was given. Why isn't it possible for everyone to be, if one might say, an individual scholar, a philosopher? Why can't people simply be left to their own devices and logically deduce the existence of God? And why is the Torah necessary? Well, the Rambam tells us that when the Israelites had stayed a long while in Egypt, they relapsed, learned the practices of their neighbors, and like them, worshipped idols. Prophets and the tribe of Levi, which steadfastly kept the charge of the patriarch. This tribe of Levi never practiced idolatry. The doctrine implanted by Abraham would, in a very short time, have been uprooted, and Jacob's descendants would have relapsed into the error and perversities universally prevalent. But because of God's love for us and because he kept the oath made to our ancestor Abraham, he appointed Moses to be our teacher and the teacher of all the prophets and charged him with his mission. After Moses had begun to exercise his prophetic functions and Israel had been chosen by the Almighty as his heritage, he crowned them with precepts and showed them the way to worship God, worship him, and how to deal with idolatry and with those who go astray after it. The idea here, of course, is that there's only one tribe, Levi or Levi, who has been able to preserve the tradition, the Masorah, one might say. And in many ways, this is the necessity for the Torah. The Torah can't exist by individuals, even if it's one particular tribe. If a nation is to function, if a nation is to be identified and to exist and to be successful in its purposes, it has to have a covenant that will provide what? The precepts, the statutes, the way to do things, halacha. It has to be governed by these things. And so this is in no way any kind of attempt to circumvent the Torah. It's the foundation of Jewish life. But what we're trying to do is look at why individuals who are not part of the covenant are not by default somehow robbed of the opportunity to serve Hashem. In fact, one of the things that I mentioned when we were doing the live shiur was that Naaman, the Assyrian, the individual, the general who is plagued with sara'at, leprosy, or some type of supernatural skin disease, whatever it may have been, goes to Elisha in the kingdom of Israel. He goes to the Jordan. He follows his instructions after some debate, and he recognizes he's healed, and he recognizes that there is one true God, the God of Israel. But what's interesting is that he doesn't convert to Judaism. He doesn't convert to Israelite religion. What he does is he takes dirt back to his land because he wants to construct a mizbeach, an altar, and he asks, in essence, for deference from Elisha for the fact that when he is with the king, he will have to help him and bow to enter into the temple. And Elisha is completely fine with that. He recognizes his position in Assyrian society. He doesn't ask him to, in essence, abandon everything that he's been part of, but he recognizes that Naaman has undergone this transformation, that he recognizes that there is one true God. And he doesn't hold it against him for that. And I think that that is extremely important for us to remember. Now, Rabbi David Hartman sort of adds to this idea about the necessity of halacha and why Sinai is critical. He states halacha provides concrete symbols which remind a person of the ultimate task, to know God. Halacha prevents the individual from becoming totally absorbed in the demands of economic and political survival. It provides within the everyday framework a means by which to achieve spiritual transcendence, the dehumanizing effect of mundane routines. This is one of the key issues of why the Torah is critical for the Jewish people. But again, it doesn't in any way discount the spiritual capacity or the standing of the souls of individuals who are not born Jewish. And this is really the ultimate idea that I am trying to communicate. Individuals are created by God and they are given a soul and they're given divine intellect, and that is something that we should never forget. Now, the Rambam, returning to the Mishneh Torah, will state that Gentiles are permitted to offer burnt offerings to God in all places, provided they sacrifice them on a raised structure that they build. It is forbidden to help them offer these sacrifices or act as agents for them, for we are forbidden to sacrifice outside the temple courtyard. It is permitted to instruct them and teach them how to sacrifice to the Almighty. Blessed be He. There's a recognition by the Rambam that there are individuals among the nations that seek to follow the God of creation, and in fact, the God of Israel. And there's nothing wrong with that. In fact, that I would say is to be encouraged. That should be the heart of Judaism. And that's one of the reasons that I found the statement that this rabbi that I mentioned at the very beginning so problematic, because if you have individuals who are not Jewish who want to learn, why would you not take advantage of that and transmit to them the knowledge of God, just as Abraham, our father, did? And in fact, something that the Rambam says is completely permitted. If an individual is actually seeking to do things correctly, why not embrace them and teach them to sort of turn from their idolatrous practices or their incorrect practices? Now, the reason that this is important is because many times there are individuals in certain religious camps within the Jewish community that are taking texts like Lekutei Amarim and the Tanya, and they are interpreting these texts as a reflection of the spiritual state of non-Jews, that they are inherently inferior. Now, is that the original intention of Shneur Zalman of Laity? I don't think it is. But if it is, then it has to be called out. Again, I'm not going to say that that was the original intention, but there are individuals who are reading this text, the souls of the nations of the world, however, emanating from the other, unclean klipot, which contain no good whatsoever. That recipe, that idea, is problematic if you interpret it literally or interpret it perhaps without further context or understanding. And I can't help but believe that the individual, the rabbi who is sort of asking non-Jews to remove themselves, in essence, is interpreting the Tanya here in that particular vein. What the Rambam is saying is that Hashem's knowledge is manifest in all of creation. And an individual, if they choose to, can deduce that there is one God and come to the logical conclusion that he is the source of all life. But if we have or interpret a passage like this in a negative fashion, then our understanding of non-Jews will take on a negative connotation. Now, it's interesting because in the medieval period in Europe, Christians often believed that Jewish men, were capable of menstruation. But they also believed that Jewish men were always looking to take advantage sexually of Christian women. They had this kind of dual concept of the Jew who is on the one hand effeminate and on the other hand is on the prey, on the prowl to take advantage of Christian women. And in many ways, I think sometimes that in the medieval period, there's sort of a reaction that comes about in Jewish communities, and particularly in the lands of Ashkenaz, towards non-Jews, towards Christians in that particular place, but it could apply to any non-Jew. As far as their spiritual state, it's like, oh, you think that we're different? Well, we think that you're different. In fact, the Maharal, the Rabbi Judah of Prague, will often emphasize the intrinsic, even not simply metaphysical differences, but the inherent physical differences that he believes are at play between Jews and non-Jews. And I think that it's understandable if we go back in time to the 16th century, to maybe appreciate the perspectives of the Maharal, but to apply that in the 21st century, especially in light of the Rambam's writings. And it's interesting because the Maharal in many times was opposed to the Rambam. I think is something that we should do very carefully. That is to say that we should take consideration of the Rambam to note as to the fact that Jews and non-Jews are both created by God and they're both given intellect and a soul that can search for the God of creation. Now, this interpretive approach to non-Jews is not something that can only be found in the Tanya or can be misread from the Tanya. But if we look at the works of Rabbi Kook, who was very much focused in on bringing every Jew within the fold, even in the land of Israel, when people would complain about non-religious Jews, he would always, use comparisons about, the lonely workers who were not religious. They were part of the building of the temple, the Beit HaMikdash. Those individuals who may not have been observant, they were still part of this redemptive process. But the Rav Kook would write the difference between the Jewish soul itself, its inner desires, its overflow, its character, its standing, and that of all the nations at all their levels is greater and deeper than the difference between the human soul and the soul of an animal. Between the latter, there is merely a quantitative distinction. Between the former, an essential distinction pertains. Now, again, it's easy for an individual to come along and look at this and say, oh, there's a difference between the Jewish soul and the non-Jewish soul. And I would suggest that this particular perspective is very problematic. Because if we assume that to be true, then how do we explain Abraham Avinu? How do we explain the fact that the patriarchs and the individuals that came before them, Noah or Noach, and all the individuals before, Shem, Ever, all these individuals, Hanoch, Enoch, how did they come to the knowledge of God? How did they invoke his name? How did they call upon the God of creation? If their souls were somehow deficient and incapable of reaching the heights that sometimes many, again, quarters of the Jewish community seem to attribute to the Jewish soul. Now, there are other religious traditions, of course, that will argue that an individual that is not part of that faith group doesn't have a full understanding. There's no question about that, and that's not problematic in and of itself. But when we talk about the human soul, and when we sort of conflate that with worth and with, I would say, the value of the individual, it's a very, very fine line. And we have to reject any perspective that, in essence, undercuts the responsibility of the Jewish community to serve as a vehicle to transmit the knowledge of God among the nations. We read that throughout the Psalms, throughout Tehillim. So many Psalms always end with to make his name known, to proclaim to the nations. It's something that is embedded within the mission of Israel. And we read about it, how Abraham Avinu is arguing with the people of Chaldees to tell them this is not right. You're not serving the creator of the universe the way that you're supposed to. And this is something that in many ways, understandably so, is often lost because of persecution, because of the dynamic between Jews and non-Jews over centuries. The very fact that in the midst of this presentation, we had two anti-Semites sort of, hijack the shiur and start spewing anti-Semitic statements and racial epithets and other things, it's sort of shocking. But at the same time, it shouldn't distract us from the ultimate mission that I believe that Jews have, and that's the mission of Abraham, our father. Now, there's something else that we also need to consider. If we look at the Talmud, Rabbi Meir, the student of many great rabbis, Rabbi Akiva and others as well, he said, how do we know that even a non-Jew who occupies himself with the Torah is comparable to the Kohen Gadol? As the verse states that mankind should live through them. There's a mistake there on the text, but it's an idea that this is accessible for all individuals. This is something that Hashem has made and desires for the nations to come close to the God of Israel and the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Now, the Rambam also makes a statement in the Mishneh Torah when he comments on laws of kings and wars. He states, we should not prevent a Noachide who desires to perform one of the Torah's mitzvot in order to receive reward from doing so, provided he performs it as required. If he brings an animal to be sacrificed as a burnt offering, we should receive it. If a Noachide who observes the 7 mitzvot gives charity, we should accept it from him. It appears to me that it should be given to the Jewish poor, for the Noahide may derive his sustenance from the Jews, and they are commanded to support him if necessary. In contrast, if an idolater gives charity, we should accept it from him and give it to the Gentile poor. It's a very interesting statement that the Rambam makes, because before this section in the same Mishnah Torah on the laws of kings and wars, he talks about uh, an akum, an individual who is a worshiper of stars, or the worshippers of stars should not study the Torah, that they're liable for the death penalty. Now, of course, there's no enforcement for that, but he's talking about the theoretical aspect of that. But then directly after that, he states, if a Noah, it says ben Noach in the Hebrew, sheratzale asot mitzvah, if they desire to keep one of the commandments, they should be allowed to do so. I think that's an amazing statement that the Rambam is making. The individual is allowed to learn, to study, and this should not be seen as a threat. Now, I think obviously the Rambam believes that these commandments are being kept within the context of a Jewish community, much, I think, like the Second Temple period, where you had the phenomena of God-fearers who would go to synagogues and they would learn and they would understand and they would, grow in their perspectives. Maybe some of them converting, some of them not. Maybe some of them choosing to remain as they were, but having, in essence, switched to a belief in the God of Israel. And I think in some sense we see that strain of thought in the Rambam, that an individual should be encouraged if they're pursuing this of their own accord, just like Abraham Avinu, deducing logically the knowledge of God, then that individual should not be prevented from doing so. Now, I think that the concerns of the Jewish community are legitimate when we see individuals in outside of the Jewish community, taking on commandments and things of that nature without any type of structure and without, one might say, rabbinic oversight. I think that is a worthy discussion in and of itself, and I see many problems with individuals who do that. But within the context of a synagogue and someone wanting to attend and someone wanting to learn, I think that that openness should be there. Now, there are reasons that, of course, the Jewish community is sometimes somewhat, there's certain consternation with respect to individuals who come in. But again, I think the idea here is to go back to the Rambam and his understanding of Abraham Avinu and the desire to disseminate the knowledge of God and to understand that fundamentally, philosophically speaking, the knowledge of God is something that is accessible to every human being. And as such, we cannot misunderstand the responsibilities and the roles of Jews with the idea of spiritual superiority. And that's something I think that the Rambam believed wholeheartedly. That's one of the reasons that when he was asked about a non-Jew who had converted to Judaism, and when he was confronted by a rabbi about not saying the Amidah, when it says, our Father, our fathers, the collective portion of those prayers, the Avot, the rabbi was telling this individual that they should not pray that because they were not biologically part of the Jewish people. And the Rambam dismisses that idea because, in essence, the first convert is Abraham Avinu, Abraham our father, who leaves his place of birth and not just physically, but spiritually takes on an identity, which, of course, is the foundation of the Jewish people. The whole point of this has been to emphasize that Hashem can be known within the covenant, but also outside of it. And if there are individuals outside of it that want to learn about the covenant, then I think that as a Jewish community, we should do everything in our power to encourage that, to educate. And if there are uncomfortable statements that exist within the broad existence of Jewish thought, then we should address those. We shouldn't pretend that they don't exist or that they haven't been misinterpreted or that they are being taken out of context, whatever might be the appropriate response. But we should be able to say that is incorrect. It's one of the amazing things about the Rambam, who believe that logic and reason are God-given faculties. And the Torah does not require us somehow to separate those elements from the faith that Hashem has given to us.